Hello again, Netrunner fans, Willingdon here, and today I'm going to be talking about Chrome City. This is the third pack in the Sand cycle, and in this first part of the video we're going to be looking at all the runner cards in the pack. We're going to kick things off with a new event for Anarch. This is called Immolation Script. It's 0 to play, it's 3 influence. It's a run type. Make a run on archives. If successful, instead of accessing a piece of ice in archives, trash a rezzed copy of that ice. On one hand, I really like the idea of giving Anarch more run events that target the archives, just because the other two factions, I think, kind of have a certain affinity for a particular central, right? Like Shaper's really good against R&D, and Criminal's really good against HQ, and Anarch, I guess, is supposed to be good against the archives, but they haven't really been. I really like the idea of giving them more run events, or just more effects targeting the archives. And I think this effect is reasonably good. The destruction of ice is something else that Anarch has been really good at, and I think has really fit well with what Anarch's trying to do. So I like the idea of all these things merging together. That said, the way that this specific card works, I'm a little iffy on it being playable. One thing that's really common with corporation decks is to spread your ice out. I tend to like to play like 2 of quite a few ice, maybe 1 of a few ice, and I think that's pretty typical, especially with the more glacier-oriented decks. We don't usually want to run 3 of a bunch of ice. So I can definitely see situations where you're holding this card and there's like 2 or 3 ice in the discard pile and you can't even get anything accomplished with this. This will be really strong though against things like the next ice or the Grail ice where the corp is incentivized to play 3 copies of a bunch of different ice. So I could see this being pretty effective against like the next ice. I don't know. I'm a little iffy on this. I think it might see some play as like a one of. I think it could make sense in something like Noise, where you're milling quite a few cards, so you're going to be a lot more likely to get the ice that you need to get the trash off. I don't know. I like this card. I'm not positive that it's going to be very good. Next up, we have the first card in what is the theme of the pack. These are the Cybernetics cards. This one's called Skulljack. It's an Anarch piece of hardware, 2 to install, 2 influence, and it's unique. When you install Skulljack, suffer 1 brain damage. The trash cost of all cards is lowered by 1. So we're going to see a whole cycle of these Cybernetics subtype hardware, and all of them do damage to you when you install them, either meat or brain damage. This one's brain damage. That's definitely a big penalty, right? Like taking a brain damage, especially later in the game, could maybe be a big problem. Now, the trash cost lowered thing, that seems okay. I don't know if it's really that great. We already have within Anarch some ways to do that I think are a little better, like Imp and even Scrubber. Now, this has the advantage of being hardware, so I think that does lend a little bit of credibility to this card. The problem with Scrubber that I've always had is that a lot of the decks that want to play it also play things that get them tagged, so it's really difficult to get the Scrubber in play and have it stay in play long enough to justify the fact that you paid to install it. I think a lot of times you just play it down, trash 1 or 2 cards, and then it's dead. So this card doesn't have that liability. It's also not taking up your MU like an Imp would. So I guess in that sense, this is an advantage over those cards. The other potential benefit with this over the other 2 is that you can use this multiple times in a turn. So if you happen to trash 3 cards in a turn, you're going to save 3 money with this, which is going to be better than Scrubber and potentially better than Imp. I will say that we are at a point in the metagame where there are a lot of cards that are trashable being played. Asset economy cards, defensive upgrades, things like that are really popular. and this card would help quite a bit against things like RP, Near Earth Hub with lots of assets, HB with the sexy robots and things like that. So this card, it seems fairly playable to me, but I'm not sure it's going to be better than some of the other alternatives that we already have within Anarch. Next up, we have a new Anarch console. This is Turntable. It's 2 to install, 2 influence, plus 1 MU. Whenever you steal an agenda, you may swap that agenda with an agenda in the corpse score area, and it's limit 1 console per player and unique as they are. This is the type of card that I think when you first read it, it just seems mind-blowing and just unbelievable. And then when you start to think about how to use this and what decks you would play it in, your enthusiasm wanes a bit. First of all, let's talk about the ability. The swapping agendas thing, that's definitely unprecedented, and it's definitely strong. The obvious thing that you can do with this is to swap lower point value cards with higher point value cards. That's pretty sexy. You know, they score future perfect, and you score NAPD contract, and you get to swap them. That seems pretty good. It also works against agendas that have some sort of effect based on counters. So we're looking at like Astro Script or Nisei or even like House of Knives or something. It also works against agendas with some sort of passive ability. So like I'm thinking like Gila Hands or Ecology or like I guess government contracts or something like that, where an agenda that has some sort of effect that the corporation can use. Now, the problem I have with this card is that some of the most popular decks still score almost exclusively 2-pointers. So we're looking at like Near Earth Hub or some of the fast advance oriented styles tend to play almost exclusively 2-pointers. They might play like a couple 1-pointers. The problem with that is that I think a lot of times you're not going to get much value out of this unless you just absolutely hit the perfect timing. So it seems kind of variance driven to me. Like with the Astro Script play I was just talking about, you're going to have to hit them at a time before they can use the Astro Script, which is certainly possible, especially if you have them in like R&D lock or something like that. But I don't necessarily think it's easy to do. And I think that there's going to be situations where they've already depleted the Astro Script counter, or maybe they use the Astro Script counter a little more aggressively than they would have in the past. And then you just get no effect out of this thing because it's just going to be swapping Beals for Astro Scripts or NAPD contracts for Beals or whatever. So I think that's kind of a problem with this. If you have a deck that plays uniform point values and doesn't play 3-pointers, I think this is a lot weaker. I think this is going to be a lot stronger against like a Glacier deck or decks that just play some sort of 3-point agendas, because I think overall the most powerful thing you can do with this is swap your 2-point agenda that you just scored for the 3-point agenda that they work so hard to score. The other kind of beef I have with this card is that a lot of the Anarch decks have some sort of console already in mind. A bunch of them are playing Desperado. Grimoire is just the best way to get 2 MU in the game. There's already some incentives to play some other consoles. I think probably my pick for runner IDs to use this, I think Max is among the top, just because Max doesn't really have a console to play. I mean, there are some okay ones to play, but in general, I don't think any of them are unbelievable. I don't know. I'm pretty iffy on this card's playability. I think it's going to definitely be predicated on the idea that you don't have a better console to play. And I think that this ability that the console has, while really cool and obviously powerful, I think it's going to be really situational and variance driven. So I'm not sure this is going to rise to the top in terms of consoles. Next up, we have an Anarch resource. This is called Chroma Parlor. It's 1 to play and it's 1 influence. It's a location. Prevent all meat damage and brain damage from installing cybernetics. Well, this is obviously going to be pretty contingent on the existent cybernetics cards. So I don't really want to talk about this card a whole lot, but in general, I think we're going to be running into similar stuff with Chroma Parlor as we were with the Gene Conditioning Shop, where it's going to be really difficult to play a card like this unless you have a whole bunch of cards with that subtype. So I don't really see this being all that extensively played, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about this when we get into some of the other cybernetics stuff. The next card is the Criminal Cybernetics card. This is Titanium Ribs. It's 1 to install, it's 2 influence, and it's unique as all the cybernetics cards are. When you install Titanium Ribs, suffer 2 meat damage. You can choose the cards from your grip to trash whenever you take damage, including the damage taken by installing it. I'm pretty iffy on this card being playable. I think that it's a nice effect to be able to choose the damage that you take, but I don't know if it's really going to be worth including a card in your deck to do that. It seems to me like it's probably not going to be worth taking the 2 meat damage from this and including the card in your deck just to get that effect. Especially if the reason you're including the card is to fight something like PE or decks that have kind of more granular damage. Taking that 2 extra meat damage seems like it's going to be a problem to me. So, I don't know, I'm pretty iffy on this thing being playable. I think the effect is decent, and I could conceive a metagame where maybe this was the right thing to play. But in general, I think this is probably going to stay in the box. The next card that we have is a new criminal icebreaker. This is called Crowbar. It's 1 to install, it's 1 MU. It's an icebreaker decoder cloud. It's 0 strength, 2 influence. If you have at least 2 link, the memory cost of Crowbar is 0 even if it's not installed. Crowbar has +1 strength for each installed icebreaker. And then it has trash, break up to 3 Codegate subroutines. So this is the second in a cycle that was started with Spike, and that was an icebreaker from the Valley data pack. We're going to see 3 icebreakers like this, I would assume, and they're each going to be trash to break 3 of a particular subroutine. Now, I had some pretty serious reservations about Spike, and I think that I feel pretty similarly, if not more that way, about Crowbar. I will say, like I said with Spike, that one of the things that Criminal is pretty bad at is having decent icebreakers, and usually we have to spend an enormous percentage of our influence on icebreakers to just be able to like get through the standard stuff that we encounter in most decks. So we're in general spending a lot of influence to get not even that great of icebreakers as Criminal. And Crowbar, maybe Spike, and maybe this other one that's going to presumably be Centuries is going to give us a new type of rig where maybe we can break a bunch of the standard types of ice we see without having to spend all that influence. Now, it's going to require a pretty substantial amount of recursion to make that work. I think the cloud aspect is going to be pretty significant. The 2-link thing is going to be pretty significant. So I'm pretty reserved on these being good. I'm not necessarily sure that there's any deck that exists right now that could really play these to good effect. I think maybe in the future, when we get the full set of these, it's possible to play like 9 of them in your deck, 3 copies of each. It could maybe make a little bit more sense. We could see that strength get up to a reasonable value. One thing I will say about Crowbar instead of Spike is that, generally speaking, the code gates that we're trying to break top out at about 4 or 5. That's not true with barriers. So I think the strength thing is maybe not as big of an issue with this one as it was with Spike. But I think both of these are probably going to sit in the box unless you have a very specialized use for them. But I'm willing to be wrong about that, and I, in some ways, kind of want to be wrong about that, because I'd like to see some different types of icebreaker schemes enter the metagame. Next up, I think we have what is pretty undisputedly the best runner card in the pack, and that is Net Ready Eyes. This is the Cybernetics card for Shaper. It's 0 to install, 2 influence, it's unique as they are, hardware cybernetics. When you install Net Ready Eyes, suffer 2 meat damage. Whenever you initiate a run, choose an icebreaker. That icebreaker has +1 strength for the remainder of the run. Well, this card is good for some obvious reasons and maybe some not as obvious reasons. The obvious reasons are that you're going to just save money on pumping your icebreakers. That's going to matter a lot, and it does last through the end of the run. So if you happen to have to use your, say, corroder on 2 barriers on a single run, the Net Ready Eyes is going to make it 3 strength for that whole run. That's pretty good. Also, the fact that you can do this every run is pretty huge as well. So if you're playing a deck that runs constantly or runs very often, you're going to be able to use this to save some money. I think this has some obvious synergy with like the Desperado Data Sucker sort of thing, because you're going to be able to get a lot of money out of running a lot. Now, maybe not as obvious, although I think pretty obvious still, is the fact that this interacts well with the fixed strength breakers. So mainly we're going to be talking about things like Yogg or Mimic, or even to maybe a lesser extent something like Ottman, right? Like if you have Ottman at 4, it might be kind of nice to pump it up to 5 and then be able to break Tollbooth really cheap or something like that. Now with Yogg, I think Yogg's the one that most people are talking about because we've seen Yogg get pretty punished by Lotus Field, which has been a huge incentive to play more than just Yogg as your code gate breaker, because if you're only playing Yogg, you're gonna run into a Lotus Field that you can't break. This is going to be a way that Yogg can overcome Lotus Field. I also think very significantly this is going to make Mimic way better in a lot of decks. Because Mimic at 3 is pretty strong, but we're mainly just looking at like Architect and stuff like that. Whereas Mimic at 4 crushes a lot of the scariest ice in the game. We're talking about a bunch of the HB stuff like Ichi or like Next Gold. And then there's just a huge variety of 4 strength sentries that are pretty scary that a Mimic with 4 strength would just completely destroy. So I think this thing's going to be pretty immediately playable. I think we're going to see people trying it out in a variety of different decks. I've kind of been thinking about a Kate deck that sort of went back to the Desperado Data Sucker as like its core, and then would focus on using mainly Ottman, but also some of the cheap influence breakers to get through stuff. I also think that this has a ton of potential in Anarch, because the fixed strength breakers, I think, stand to gain the most from this ability, and the Anarch decks, or at least some of the Anarch decks, are pretty run intensive. So I think maybe something like Max, or Edward Kim, or maybe even Reyna could see some good use of this card. I don't know. I think that this card is going to see play. I think it's not going to be the type of card that's in a ton of decks, but I think it's going to be worth the 2 influence in the right deck. And I think that this is a type of card that it has a lot of possibility to see play right out of the pack. The next card in the pack is a new program for Shaper. It's called Analog Dreamers. It's 2 to install, 1 MU, and it's 3 influence. It has click, make a run on R&D. If successful, instead of accessing cards, you may choose an unresed non-ice card with no advancement tokens on it. The corp shuffles that card into R&D. So here's a way that we're going to be able to shuffle things like assets, or maybe defensive upgrades, or other various cards installed in servers back into the corporation's deck without having to deal with them or without the corporation getting to use their effects. Now, the main problem I'm seeing with this card is that if you play this card and you use it, your opponent's going to have a window where they can res the cards that you would potentially shuffle in. Now, that's going to mean that they have to spend the money maybe when they didn't want to, but I think that there's a fair number of circumstances where you're using this thing and they just res and it doesn't really have any sort of adverse effect on them. Now you could still choose to access like normal, but then why even bother with this card, right? I do see that this has some potential against like PE or maybe against some other decks where they have assets that are like traps or are things that they're not intending to res right away. I think some of the near Earth hub decks that are focused on meat damage, those tend to have cards that they don't immediately res. And they also tend to play some kind of trappy things in the form of like Too Good to Be True or a few other cards. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that could be a use of this card. I'm pretty iffy about this. I saw several people online talking about using this card against Caprice or against Ash or something like that. And I think the idea is that if you use this card, they're going to be forced to res those types of effects, and then you're going to know what server they're on, and you're going to force them to spend the credits at that time. The problem I'm seeing with this is that's really just not that good, and I think basically that's cherry picking one of the best possible plays that you could make with this card. Now, a lot of times I like to go through a thought experiment with new cards where I think about what the best possible thing that we could do with the card would be. But the reason I go through that thought experiment is to determine if the card is good enough to play, even in the best case scenario. And I think there's a huge number of cards that when they come out, you come up with the best case scenario and they're not even good enough in that scenario, let alone in a more average, more common scenario. So I think this card, if we can assume that the Caprice play or something similar to the Caprice play is one of the best things that you can accomplish with this card, I don't think that's going to happen very often, and I think even when it does, the effect isn't worth justifying the inclusion of this card. So I'm seeing this card mainly as a sort of metagame choice against specific strategies that look to have lots of assets in play, and they're not necessarily able to res all of them, or maybe upgrades or just various stuff like that. Like, they're not going to necessarily be able to res all of them. I don't know how many decks there are that really play like that now, and I don't see this really pulling enough weight for the time being, but I think maybe in the future, if the metagame moves around a little bit, we could see this see play as maybe like a one of in a variety of decks. The last card in the pack is the Neutral Cybernetics card. This is Brain Cage. It's 1 to install, 0 influence, it's unique, and it's hardware cybernetics. When you install Brain Cage, suffer 1 brain damage, your maximum hand size is increased by 3. So as the Neutral Cybernetics card, I kind of expected a little more from this. I don't really think this effect is that strong. First of all, you're going to take a brain damage, so realistically your hand size is only going to be increased by 2 rather than 3. You're also going to have to pay a money for that. I think unless you have effects in your deck that are based on maximum hand size, I don't think this is going to be playable at all. This is going to be playable, though, if what you're trying to do is get the highest possible maximum hand size. So if whatever you're doing in your deck is reliant on extremely high maximum hand sizes, this might be a choice to supplement some of the other effects that we have to increase hand size. So, Beach Party plus this, potentially pretty good, things like that. I don't know, this is probably going to sit in the box for me. That's going to do it for part 1 of Chrome City. I have to admit that I'm a little bit disappointed with the cybernetics cards. I think that unlike the genetics cards, the cybernetics really aren't all that strong on their own, and I don't think there's a ton of incentive to play the Chroma Parlor. With the genetics cards, we've seen a pretty big splash from Symmetrical Visage. There's been a lot of people playing it in the way that I described in my review as kind of a single-use pro-con. And we've also seen a fair amount of adjusted chronotype with things like Wildside. I don't really see a ton of play out of any of the cybernetics cards, though I do think both Net-Ready Eyes and Skulljack have some potential. I think barring some more cybernetics cards seeing print, there's really not going to ever be an incentive to build a cybernetics-oriented deck in the way that I think maybe there could be one for genetics. So I don't know, I think this is not the worst pack. I'm a little disappointed with this stuff, but I do think there's a lot of good stuff on the corpse side of the pack. So make sure you tune in over there for part 2 of the review. And if you like this video, please press subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up. I'll see you over in part 2.